Okay, you guys, after 12, 13, 14 days of driving thousands of miles across half the friggin' country, I finally made it here to where the Donner Party got stuck. Now, at this point, even after 1,500 miles of often grueling travel, the Donner Party had only lost 4 members. Sarah Keyes back at Alcove Spring and Luke Halloran at the base of the Wasatch Mountain from consumption. John Snyder, the teamster killed by James Reed at Iron Point. And another party member, a German by the name of Wolfinger, had mysteriously disappeared at the Humboldt Sink. The same Indian attack that had cost the Eddy family all but one of their oxen had also taken all but one of Wolfinger's. Unable to continue pulling his wagon, Wolfinger had decided to cache it at the Humboldt Sink, but the rest of the party didn't feel like waiting for him and just kept rolling along. Except for Keseberg, the grumpy German, who stayed behind to supposedly help him. But when Keseberg caught up with the rest of the party that night, he was alone. He claimed Wolfinger was on his way, but Wolfinger never showed up. Interestingly, it was rumored that Wolfinger had been carrying a large stash of money. In any event, Wolfinger's wife carried on alone, bringing the total number of the Donner Party to 84. But they were about to lose one more. As the emigrants finally approached the base of the Sierra Mountains, they were running low on supplies yet again and decided to send a couple more men ahead to Sutter's Fort to bring back food. As they were preparing to ride ahead on this mission, one of the 2 men, William Foster, accidentally shot and killed the other, his brother-in-law, William Pike. It was an honest mistake and an unfortunate accident, and maybe something of an omen of the misfortune to come. The Donner Party reached what they called Truckee Meadows, present-day Reno, on October 22nd. This was their last stop before crossing the mountains, which they were now at the foot of. It must have been pretty freaky to look up at what they were about to cross. These mountains are no joke. If you've ever been to the Sierras, you know what I mean. They drop off really steeply on the eastern slope, and the best place to cross them, anywhere near the California Trail, is over 7,000 feet in elevation. And half of these people were still dragging wagons behind them. It was gonna take everything they had to get up and over these mountains before they got snowed in. But the lateness of their arrival meant they couldn't afford to rest for very long. They had to get going as soon as possible. It might start snowing any day. Generally, immigrants tried to cross the Sierras by the end of September to avoid this problem. But as we've seen, the Donner Party suffered a number of setbacks, some of their own doing and some just due to bad luck. And that left them at the base of the Sierras at the end of October, dangerously close to the first snows. Still, they had to recharge for at least a few days before making the monumental effort to cross a 7,000-foot mountain pass. So they rested at Truckee Meadows for around 5 days, and in retrospect, they probably should have just given up and settled down for the winter right then and there. At this relatively low elevation, they would have had plenty of water, firewood, and game to hunt, and they probably could have waited out the winter in relative comfort. But of course, they had no way of knowing that there were exceptionally gnarly storms ahead. And they still held out hope they could make it over the pass just in time. So, starting around October 27th, families began setting out to climb the mountains. Each went as fast as they could, some slower than others due to injury. The German guy Caseberg had injured his foot about a week earlier, and George Donner had cut his hand pretty badly trying to repair a broken axle on his wagon, so neither of their families could move very quickly. One bright spot was the reappearance of Charles Stanton, one of the two men they had sent ahead to get fresh supplies way back at the beginning of the Nevada crossing. Well, he had made it all the way to Sutter's Fort in Sacramento and then hiked all the way back over the mountains to bring fresh supplies to the others. And he didn't even have a family. He was traveling solo. He crossed over that friggin' pass and came back just to help the others. Talk about a solid act of human kindness. Anyway, by October 31st, all the families had arrived at the base of what's now called Donner Pass. The night before, it had snowed 8 inches, so they knew they had to get up and over quick. But by the time they arrived here at what's now called Donner Lake, they were simply too exhausted to go any further. Okay, you guys, after 12, 13, 14 days of driving thousands of miles across half the friggin' country, I finally made it here to where the Donner Party got stuck. It's pretty intense. I mean, what's sad is it's such a beautiful place. Here's a 360. It's like this alpine meadow. We're at around 6,000 feet here. And of course it's mid-July, so it's warm and sunny. You can hear these little crickets and bees buzzing. Like a super beautiful, peaceful place. And there's no like weird bad vibes or energy, or I don't feel any weird bad vibes or energy, even though pretty unspeakable things happened here. So this is actually a place called Alder Creek. I'm not sure if the creek is dried up or if it's still running or where it is, but I'm on this little kind of interpretive loop hike that has little signs that tells you about it. And this is where the Donner families spent that whole nasty winter. Now, most of the families in the Donner Party were 6 miles ahead, up like right almost at the top of the pass where Donner Lake is, and that's where they got stuck and snowed in. But the actual Donner families, George Donner and his family, Jacob Donner and his families, and a few others, were actually 6 miles behind them here at Alder Creek, because George Donner broke that axle on his wagon and he stopped here to repair it, and he cut his hand and it got infected, and you know, then the snow started to get too deep, so they were actually, the Donner families were here 6 miles away from everybody else in the party. And what's really screwed up is because George Donner's hand was messed up and, you know, Jacob Donner, everybody else was too weak, they didn't even have the wherewithal to actually build a cabin to wait out the winter. They just built a kind of like a lean-to out of pine branches, leaned against a big tree, and then they covered that. Well, I'll show you, there's a picture on this little sign here. Look, you can see they just kind of leaned poles up against a tree and then covered that with the canvas from one of their wagons and made kind of like a, well, I guess like a lean-to shanty. And they spent the whole friggin' winter in that shanty. Can you imagine? I mean, there was like at least 10 feet of snow, and I can't imagine that it was very warm in there. Whew. Again, though, you would never know that anything terrible happened here. Huh? Nature takes back over and heals all wounds. So here at the site, at the base of this big tree, there is a historical marker saying that this was the actual Donner campsite where the Donner parties camped out. But apparently that was fake news, because over here is another plaque placed by the actual Donner families, the descendants of the actual Donner families. This plaque says that that's not the actual tree. The tree they built their shanty on stood for 150 years after they camped here, and then it finally succumbed to Mother Nature in the winter of 1996. Wow, can you imagine? I wonder what happened to that tree, where it is now. It'd be a trip to have a piece of it. Anyway, back on October 31st, 1846, the Donner Party had finally made it to the base of the pass that would get them over the Sierra, and they were now facing the daunting prospect of hauling their exhausted and malnourished families up and over this 7,000-foot high mountain pass. The weather that evening was clear, so some in the party wanted to push on over the pass while they still could, because apparently there was a ring around the moon indicating another coming storm. But the women insisted that the children needed some rest, just a few hours, so they built a fire and everyone passed out in exhaustion. And when they woke up in the morning, they were covered in snow. And more snow was falling, fast and heavy. I can't imagine the feeling of impending doom that must have gripped these poor, exhausted travelers. I mean, say what you will about their motivations and the mistakes they'd made, they were just ordinary humans like you and me. And the sight of that snow falling must have been absolutely terrifying. So they loaded up at first light and tried to struggle through the snow over the pass. But the snow was already too deep, up to the axles of the wagons. And abandoning the wagons was no use because the travelers themselves sunk in up to their hips in fresh, soft, powdery snow, making progress impossible, especially with all those little kids. I mean, something like half of the Donner Party was under 10 years old. So they had no choice but to turn back and wait for the weather to clear. Back at what's now Donner Lake, there was a rough little cabin that had been built by a previous pioneer. So some of the families crowded into that, with the others setting up tents and lean-tos. Any kind of shelter against the howling snowstorm. At this point, they were probably still optimistic that the weather would eventually clear and they'd make it over the pass before winter really started. I mean, it was only November 1st. But unfortunately for them, the winter of 1846 was a doozy. It started early and it lasted through April. It's so frustrating to think that they came so close to getting over the mountains. I mean, if they'd gotten there one day earlier, one day, they would have made it. In fact, the docent I talked to at that interpretive center in Elko said that some historians believe they were only a few hours too late. Either way, it's easy to look back and say that they shouldn't have rested so long at Truckee Meadows or after they crossed the Utah Salt Desert, or for 4th of July, or when they stopped to bury Sarah Keys at Alcove Springs. Shoulda, coulda, woulda.